On the morning of April 14th, 1987, a senior officer at NATO's Southern Command headquarters in Naples walked into a windowless room and ordered the immediate shutdown of a radio frequency that had been broadcasting continuously for nearly 9 years. No explanation was given to the technicians. No memo was circulated. The frequency simply disappeared from the spectrum, erased as cleanly as chalk wiped from a blackboard. Within 72 hours, 3 Warsaw Pact listening posts in Bulgaria, Romania, and East Germany went silent. 2 weeks later, a mid-level signals analyst in the Polish intelligence service was found dead in his apartment in Krakow, his wrists slashed, though his colleagues would later insist he showed no signs of distress. By June, the entire Eastern European signals intelligence network had been restructured, costing millions of rubles and delaying operations across 4 countries. The frequency that caused all of this had never been classified. It had never been secret. In fact, for most of its existence, nobody thought it mattered at all. It started with a woman named Diane Kowalski, a civilian telecommunications technician working for a military contractor in Stuttgart, West Germany. She was 41 years old, divorced, no children, and had been employed in the same role for 11 years. Her job was to maintain radio equipment used by American forces stationed across southern Germany. She calibrated transmitters, tested signal strength, replaced vacuum tubes, and logged frequency allocations in thick binders that no one ever read. It was repetitive, solitary work, the kind that required just enough attention to prevent boredom, but not enough to feel important. Diane lived in a small apartment near the base, ate lunch alone most days, and spent her evenings watching dubbed American sitcoms on the Armed Forces Network. She was, by every measure, invisible. Her workspace was a prefabricated maintenance shed tucked behind a motor pool, far from the administrative buildings where officers worked. The shed smelled like oil and old paper. The walls were lined with metal shelving units, stacked with technical manuals, coils of copper wire, and labeled bins of resistors and capacitors. In one corner sat a radio monitoring station, a rack of receivers and oscilloscopes that Diane used to check outgoing signals for interference or drift. It was standard equipment, nothing sophisticated. She'd been using the same setup since 1979. Part of her job involved maintaining a low-priority communications channel used by logistics units to coordinate supply convoys between Stuttgart and other NATO bases. The frequency, designated Hotel 79 in internal logs, operated in the high-frequency band around 23 megahertz. It wasn't used for anything sensitive. Mostly it carried mundane traffic, requests for spare parts, fuel delivery schedules, convoy timing updates, weather reports. The messages were transmitted in plain language, unencrypted, because the content was considered too trivial to warrant security measures. If an enemy intercepted a message about tire shipments or cafeteria supply orders, it wouldn't matter. That was the assumption. Diane's responsibility was to make sure the frequency stayed clear and operational. Every Monday morning, she powered up the monitoring equipment, tuned the receiver to Hotel 79, and listened for a few minutes to confirm the signal was clean. Then she logged the check in her maintenance book and moved on to other tasks. It was a 5-minute routine, performed hundreds of times without incident. But in the autumn of 1978, Diane made a small mistake. She was adjusting the frequency dial on the receiver, trying to eliminate a faint hum she'd been hearing for days. She turned the knob a fraction too far, shifting the receiver about 60 kilohertz higher than Hotel 79's assigned band. The hum disappeared, and she forgot to turn the dial back. From that point forward, every time she performed her Monday check, she was actually monitoring a completely different frequency. She didn't realize it. The receiver still picked up signals, still showed activity on the scope. Everything seemed normal. What Diane was now listening to, without knowing it, was a frequency being used by a covert NATO signals relay system. This system had been established in 1976 as part of a classified program designed to provide redundant communication paths for intelligence sharing between NATO member states. The relay operated automatically, bouncing encrypted data packets between ground stations in West Germany, Italy, Turkey, and Norway. The content was genuinely sensitive. Intelligence assessments, code names, operational updates, technical specifications of surveillance equipment. But the transmissions were encrypted using a cipher system that NATO considered unbreakable, a rotating polyalphabetic key generated by a mechanical device located in a vault in Brussels. Because the encryption was deemed secure, the frequency itself wasn't hidden. It sat openly in the spectrum, just another signal among thousands. The Soviet Union and its allies had known about this frequency for years. They monitored it constantly, recording every transmission, running the encrypted data through cryptanalysis machines in Moscow and East Berlin. They never broke the cipher. The mathematics were sound, and the key rotation was too fast. But they kept listening, hoping for a mistake, a flaw, a moment of human error that might crack the system open. Diane's accidental shift created something the Soviets hadn't anticipated. Every Monday, when she logged her maintenance check, she wrote down the time, date, and a brief note about signal quality. Clear, no interference. Slight static, likely atmospheric. Strong signal, stable. These notes were meaningless to her, just part of the bureaucratic routine. But because she was now monitoring the covert relay instead of the logistics channel, her logs became an unintended record of when the classified system was active and when it wasn't. She noted outages, periods of silence, fluctuations in signal strength. She recorded them dutifully in her maintenance binder, which sat on a shelf in the unlocked shed. The shed wasn't a secure facility. It was behind a fence, but the gate was often left open during the day so trucks could access the motor pool. Civilian contractors, German municipal workers, delivery drivers, and off-duty soldiers passed through the area regularly. The maintenance shed itself was rarely locked. Diane sometimes left the door open for ventilation. Other technicians borrowed tools. Cleaning staff emptied the trash. It was an informal, low-security environment, which made sense given the nature of the work. There was nothing classified inside, or so everyone believed. In the spring of 1980, a Bulgarian intelligence officer named Georgi Tashev was reassigned to Sofia after a disappointing tour in West Berlin. He was 36 years old, fluent in German, and considered competent but unremarkable by his superiors. His new role involved managing a small team of analysts who processed reports from sources inside West Germany, mostly low-level informants who provided information about NATO troop movements, base layouts, and logistics. It was unglamorous work, far from the high-profile espionage operations run out of Moscow. One of Tashev's sources was an East German man named Rolf Biermann, who worked as a delivery driver for a catering company that serviced American military bases in southern Germany. Biermann wasn't a trained spy. He'd been recruited in 1977 after a routine background check revealed gambling debts, and he supplemented his income by passing along bits of information he picked up during deliveries: which buildings were being renovated, where new antennas were being installed, the names of senior officers he overheard in hallways. The information was rarely valuable, but it was easy to collect and required little risk. In August 1980, Biermann mentioned in a debriefing that he'd noticed a maintenance shed near the motor pool, where the door was frequently left open. He'd walked past it several times and seen shelves full of technical manuals and equipment logs. He thought someone might be interested. Tashev filed the report with dozens of others, not expecting much. But a colleague in Sofia, reviewing the reports weeks later, noticed the mention of equipment logs and asked Biermann to take a closer look the next time he was on the base. Biermann agreed, mostly because it seemed like an easy task. On his next delivery, in October, he walked into the shed during a lunch break when no one was around. He didn't take anything. He just flipped through a few of the binders on the shelf, photographing random pages with a small camera hidden in his coat. He didn't understand what he was looking at. The notes were technical, full of frequency designations and signal strength measurements. He handed the film over at his next meeting and forgot about it. The photographs eventually made their way to a signals intelligence unit in East Berlin, where they sat in a processing queue for nearly 2 months. Analysts there were drowning in intercepts and reports, most of which were routine or irrelevant. When someone finally reviewed Biermann's photos in late December, they almost discarded them. The pages looked like standard maintenance logs, the kind of bureaucratic record-keeping that filled filing cabinets all over West Germany. But one analyst, a woman named Ingrid Lemke, noticed something odd. Lemke had been working on the NATO relay frequency for 3 years, part of a team tasked with monitoring its activity and looking for patterns. She recognized the frequency designation in one of Diane's log entries. The timing notations matched outages and fluctuations that Lemke's own equipment had recorded. She cross-referenced the logs with her monitoring data and realized they were a perfect match. Somehow, someone on the American side was keeping a detailed, time-stamped record of the relay system's operational status, and that record was sitting in an unlocked shed. This was extraordinary. Encryption kept the content of messages secret, but knowing when a system was transmitting, when it went silent, and how its signal strength varied could reveal almost as much. Patterns of activity could indicate when operations were being planned or executed. Outages might signal technical problems, maintenance windows, or changes in personnel. Signal strength could reveal the location of mobile transmitters. Over time, these data points could be used to map the entire network, identify vulnerabilities, and predict behavior. Lemke wrote a detailed report and sent it up the chain. It reached Moscow within a week. Analysts at the GRU, Soviet military intelligence, immediately understood the value. They ordered an expansion of the collection effort. Biermann was instructed to return to the shed whenever possible and photograph every page of Diane's logs, going back as far as he could find. Over the next year, he made 11 trips into the shed, always during lunch breaks or shift changes, always alone. He photographed maintenance records, frequency logs, signal reports. He was careful, methodical, and lucky. No one ever saw him. By mid-1981, The Soviets had accumulated nearly 3 years of operational data on the NATO relay system. They fed the information into analysis programs and began constructing a detailed operational profile. They identified peak transmission periods, correlated them with known NATO military exercises, and discovered that certain signal patterns preceded intelligence sharing events between member states. They mapped the geographic distribution of relay stations based on signal strength variations. They even identified individual transmitters by analyzing subtle frequency drift patterns that Diane had noted as signal instability. The intelligence was so valuable that it was classified at the highest level and shared only with a select group of officers in Moscow and East Berlin. It became the foundation for an ongoing counterintelligence operation codenamed Orel, or Eagle, which aimed to track NATO intelligence activities in real time and, if necessary, disrupt them. But the Soviets made a critical mistake. They acted on the information too effectively. In the fall of 1982, NATO conducted a large-scale intelligence sharing exercise involving encrypted communications between ground stations in Germany, Italy, and Turkey. It was a routine drill designed to test the relay system under simulated wartime conditions. The exercise was not publicly announced, and only a small number of NATO personnel knew the exact timing. Yet within hours of the exercise beginning, Soviet signals intelligence units across Eastern Europe shifted their monitoring resources to match the transmission schedule almost perfectly. They were listening in the right places at the right times, as if they knew the exercise was happening before it started. A NATO signals officer in Ankara noticed the coordinated Soviet response and flagged it in a report. Similar observations came from operators in Naples and Stuttgart. The reports were reviewed by a counterintelligence team at NATO headquarters in Brussels, and they saw the pattern. The Soviets were responding to NATO activities with a precision that suggested foreknowledge. Someone, somewhere, had access to operational information. An internal security review was launched in early 1983. It focused initially on personnel with high-level clearances, looking for a mole inside NATO intelligence. Hundreds of officers were interviewed, their travel records and financial histories reviewed. Nothing turned up. The investigation expanded to include signal security, examining whether the encryption system itself had been compromised. Cryptographers in Brussels ran tests, checked the key generators, reviewed transmission protocols. The system was secure. The breakthrough came from an unexpected direction. A NATO communications officer in Stuttgart, conducting a routine audit of frequency allocations, noticed that a civilian maintenance technician had been filing logs under the wrong frequency designation for years. The officer flagged it as a clerical error and asked someone to correct the records. When the logs were retrieved and reviewed, someone noticed that the incorrect frequency Diane had been monitoring was the same one used by the covert relay system. At first, it seemed like a coincidence, but when counterintelligence officers examined the logs more closely, they realized the entries contained detailed, time-stamped information about the relay's operational status. And when they checked the physical security of the location where the logs were stored, they discovered the shed had been accessible to dozens of people, including contract workers, delivery drivers, and unvetted civilians. A quiet investigation began in the spring of 1984. Security officers reviewed visitor logs, delivery schedules, and personnel files for anyone with regular access to the motor pool area. They interviewed Diane, who was baffled and horrified to learn she'd been monitoring the wrong frequency. She showed them the receiver, explained the hum she'd been trying to fix, demonstrated how easy it was to accidentally shift the dial. She had no idea her logs had been compromised. The investigators believed her. They expanded the inquiry to include anyone who might have entered the shed without authorization. Bierman's catering company was on a list of contractors with regular access to the base. His background was checked, and a routine inquiry with West German police revealed the earlier financial issues that had made him vulnerable to recruitment. That was enough to warrant surveillance. Bierman was followed for 6 months. He met regularly with a contact in a cafe in Mannheim who was eventually identified as a Bulgarian intelligence officer operating under diplomatic cover. Bierman was arrested in November 1984 during a controlled exchange. He confessed almost immediately. He provided details of his recruitment, the instructions he'd been given, and the 11 times he'd entered the shed to photograph Diane's logs. He didn't know why the information was valuable, but he understood it had been passed to the Soviets. The arrest wasn't made public. NATO wanted to avoid revealing the extent of the compromise, and they needed time to assess the damage and decide on a response. Bierman was quietly tried in a closed military tribunal and sentenced to 15 years in prison. He served 9. For NATO, the discovery was catastrophic. The Soviets had been reading detailed operational data on a classified communication system for nearly 4 years. They knew when the system was active, where the transmitters were located, and how the network was structured. Worse, they'd been using that information to track NATO intelligence operations in real time. It was one of the most damaging signals intelligence compromises of the Cold War, and it had happened because of a maintenance technician's accidental dial adjustment and an unlocked shed. The immediate response was to change everything. The relay system was overhauled, its frequencies reassigned, its transmission protocols altered. New encryption methods were introduced, and the entire network was moved to a more secure operational framework. But NATO also had to address the deeper problem. The Soviets now knew the structure and capabilities of the relay system, and that knowledge couldn't be erased. Every future operation that relied on the system would have to assume the Soviets understood how it worked. In early 1987, NATO leadership made a final decision. The specific frequency that Diane had been accidentally monitoring, the one that Bierman had photographed and the Soviets had exploited, would be permanently decommissioned. It would be removed from the spectrum entirely, its designation deleted from all official records. The decision was partly symbolic, a way to close the chapter on the compromise, but it was also practical. As long as the frequency existed, it would remain associated with the breach, a reminder of vulnerability. On April 14, 1987, the frequency was shut down. The order came from Naples, quietly and without fanfare. Technicians powered off the transmitters, updated the frequency allocation tables, and moved on. Within days, Soviet listening posts that had been monitoring the frequency for years went silent. The sudden disappearance was noted immediately in Moscow. Analysts understood what it meant. The compromise had been discovered, the damage contained, and the operation was over. The fallout extended beyond NATO. In Poland, a signals analyst named Tadeusz Kowalczyk had been working with the data from Oral for 2 years, producing assessments of NATO activities based on the stolen logs. He'd built his reputation on the accuracy of those assessments. When the frequency disappeared and the flow of information stopped, his superiors began asking questions. How had the intelligence been so reliable? What was the source? Kowalczyk couldn't answer without implicating the entire operation, which had been compartmentalized at the highest levels. He became a scapegoat, blamed for the sudden loss of a critical intelligence stream. 2 weeks after the frequency was shut down, he was found dead in his apartment. The official cause was suicide, though colleagues suspected he'd been eliminated to prevent further inquiries. The Eastern European Signals Intelligence Network was restructured at enormous cost. Listening posts were relocated, personnel reassigned, budgets reallocated. The oral program was quietly disbanded, its records sealed. For Soviet intelligence, it was a humiliating failure, a reminder that even the most sophisticated operations could collapse because of a single overlooked detail. Diane Kowalski was never charged with anything. The investigation concluded she had acted without knowledge or intent. She'd simply made a small, understandable mistake and never corrected it. But her career was over. She was reassigned to a clerical position in a supply depot, far from any communications equipment, and she retired quietly in 1989. She never spoke publicly about what had happened. Friends who knew her later said she remained haunted by it, by the knowledge that her accidental error had enabled one of the most significant intelligence breaches of the Cold War. The maintenance shed in Stuttgart was demolished in 1991, replaced by a parking lot. The logs Bierman had photographed were destroyed after the investigation concluded. NATO's official records of the incident remain classified, though some details have emerged over the years through declassified reports and interviews with former intelligence officers. The frequency itself, Hotel 79 in the old logs, no longer exists in any operational sense. It was reassigned, used briefly for other purposes, and eventually abandoned as communication technologies evolved. But in the classified histories kept in Brussels and Moscow, it's remembered as a cautionary tale, a reminder that the Cold War's most damaging secrets often leaked not through brilliant espionage or technological breakthroughs, but through mundane human error, unlocked doors, and the invisible routines of ordinary people who never imagined they were part of anything important. Diane spent her final years in a small town in Pennsylvania, living alone in a house her sister helped her buy. She gardened, read mystery novels, and volunteered at a local library. She rarely mentioned her time in Germany, and when she did, she described it as boring office work, nothing worth discussing. She died in 2003 at the age of 67, largely forgotten by history. But in the locked archives of intelligence agencies across Europe, her name appears in reports and assessments, always in footnotes, always as the unwitting catalyst for a disaster no one saw coming. The frequency she accidentally monitored has been quiet for nearly 4 decades now, a ghost in the spectrum, silently testifying to the strange truth that the Cold War was often decided not by grand strategies or heroic spies, but by the smallest, most forgettable mistakes made by people who were never supposed to matter at all.